Continuing on, part 2. Yeah, sounds way more diminutively Cascaves to me. Probably bullied mercilessly by some Amazon warrior at work. We used to have one, but she found her heart's desire in Vancouver, thank God. Do I smell a personal vendetta? No, but she was getting around to me. I was doing a month in children's and managed to be surrounded by Tweety birds every time she came by. But I did help to bandage a couple of her victims in the lunchroom. Andrew recalled some lesbians with a bad attitude at the TTC. Paranoid and verging on delusional, he'd thought at the time, but that had mellowed into memories of spirited after-work squabbles at one of their favourite watering holes. Debating the patriarchy with lesbians wasn't much different from arguing capitalism with Marxists. Fanatical true believers who could turn the tables and make you not just the guilty party, but down on yourself to boot. Low self-esteem, that must have been it. Never would fall for that now, would he? No, not a chance. Then Janet asked, demurely as was her preference when slipping a strap off her shoulder, whether he liked her new slip, bought only yesterday. He asked if she might turn sideways so he could have a better look, and look he did as she twisted this way and that, standing and bending over as requested, showing her bottom and its little secret peach. The storytelling came to a close as they steamed up another of their own. Following the shared flush, they agreed, or Janet decided and Andrew agreed, that coming over for round 2, or maybe 3, was not in their best interests as Janet had a big day ahead. Andrew decided not to pursue the matter further. Their interlude had been most pleasing, and there'd always be other occasions. He made himself a sandwich, poured himself a beer, and picked Altman's 3 Women off the shelf and settled in for the dream. Amazingly, no one called to disrupt his sojourn in the parallel universe of his choice, and when he emerged later, more remade than refreshed, a stroll out to the lakeside in his bare feet over slightly damp, cool grass, while warm evening air eddied about him to the lapping of the shore where he stayed enchanted, was just what the doctor ordered. Life went on, all bumps and curves, but the eternity of now is where he really lived. Beyond happy, beyond sad, neither fleeing pain nor running after pleasure, bereft of agendas. There was nothing left to do but breathe and be aware, and even that seemed a bit superfluous. At some point he departed from perfection and found himself brushing teeth and peering at pimples. Mundane a la mode. He slipped under the covers, suspecting sleep was nowhere near. Fortunately, he was in the midst of another McCall Smith mystery. The baby was abed and Jamie was singing folk songs to Isabel, who was feeling like the luckiest woman in Edinburgh, if not Scotland. Well, thought Andrew, someone has to be happy in this miserable world. Someone other than me, that is. Line after line of words wooed the narrative. Andrew fell into their romance and then slipped into the arms of sleep, all without the book falling on his head. It did not take long for a dream to make itself felt. And for once a dream whose meaning was obvious. Lara stood there in some kind of empty space, smiling, and then just a few feet away stood another Lara, this one holding a baby. Then Lara disappeared and the baby floated in space. Then the baby was a flash of light and then gone. The Lara on the left made a point of waving. Maybe goodbye, maybe hello, and then she was gone. Andrew awakened at about 3 a.m. with the memory of this fresh and alive. Well, no question who the baby once was. V would not be surprised. When they debated the options last time, she'd been the one convinced, and Andrew still the doubter. V felt they were arguing the toss to avoid facing the fact. Andrew shied away from calling it a fact. V called him on it. Her best friend was going to be her child, and his lover was about to be his child. Well, eventually, after Alex had his fill and moved on. Andrew thought that callous. V said she was being realistic. Andrew wasn't so sure. Maybe Alex's longing for Anna would pull him into the other world, and they could say he died of a broken heart and quietly shift the furniture about. But maybe he'd tough it out for another decade. Many people did live well into their 90s these days. He was only 88. Well, 89 with a touch of emphysema. He pushed himself out of bed and sipped on some water. Then he returned to his McCall Smith mystery. The missing handbag had been discovered, minus the all-important wallet with proofs of purchase. The Turner sketches would remain under lock and key, and the doctor's wife untraceable. Meanwhile, Jamie had to practice for a Gillian Weir concerto. Cloud cover at 6 a.m. made the summer dawn almost deniable. And he lay there, feeling cozy and unconcerned about the day's schedule. Did the day have a schedule? He couldn't remember. Maybe it would be another stretch of aimless perfection, chasing its tail until dusk. Wouldn't that be grand? Hours and hours of nothing in particular to do. Breakfast was leisurely, toast and some kind of odd-tasting cheese that had lost its label but not its character, and some OK Canyon. Then the blissful quiet of the conservatory, followed by an activation of the fountain, feeding the pattering tinkle. A contemplative interlude that cruised awfully close to sleep. Then, the first big mistake of the day, email. Topping the list was an SOS from Bronwyn. It had been ages since she'd put electronic pen to paper, and the sour taste of her last missive was not far from his mouth. Of course, that was all forgotten in her current crisis mode. Boyfriend Ted had gotten himself wrongly accused in some murder trial in the boonies, and was desperately needing a good lawyer, which of course only Andrew could afford. Braun was almost certain he'd been set up by a couple of psycho dykes offering an unwanted husband. But since Ted was this guy's pal, Reed dope dealer, and had been visiting only an hour before his disappearance, they'd concocted a yarn about missing pot and money, all fingers pointing his way. Ted admitted he'd been over to get a couple of ounces, one for him and another for a ham distribution. Reed a pound for pure profit. Ted may be a bit of a wastrel, but he's got a good heart and would never be violent, and so on. He ignored the other emails, shut down the computer and wandered over to the stereo for some musical relief. A collection of Arvo Part's religious minimalism seemed to fit the bill, and he stretched out on the couch to absorb it. The calm of resonant cathedrals quickly dismissed the tawdry details of Bronwyn's Peely, and her voice washed away on some voice celestial shore. The music over, he rose to attend another service, this time in the conservatory, where the winsome chatter of the fountain fetched him up on some other forgotten shore. The money, of course, was not a problem, but Bronwyn's hypocrisy, slagging him off for his attachment to things and status, and generally showing off while she modulated her humility with regular helpings of pious righteousness, galled him no end. It had galled him right back to his bus driver days, when his almost but not quite audiophile stereo became the target of her offensives. Yes, it was worth over $6,000, and those speakers were imported, and a lot of that vinyl was scarcer than hen's teeth, but he did pay for the shot with his very own bi-weekly and enjoyed it immensely. For some reason he recalled playing her Tangerine Dream Phaedra in the candlelit dark, its mysterious landscape of electronic whooshes and whispers drawing little yips and yelps from her sleeping pooch. He'd wanted her to experience music beyond categories, standalone genius that emerged out of a void and disappeared back into it without fanfare. Not rollicking rock, not gorgeous ballads, not stomping orchestral crescendos, but magic without analyzable substance. He recalled another occasion when they made love on the carpet, again in the candlelit dark, to Steve Tippett's Northern Song, itself a whispering hymn to the silence that straddles the echoous void. Now he was getting sentimental, weepingly sentimental. Oh, can't have that. Falling not for Bronwyn, but her fire-lit memory. No, that was dangerous. Back to a simpler time when life was a series of simple choices. Lunch at home or lunch out. Dinner with her mum or a drink by her basement bedroom fireside, where nodding off, heads on each other's shoulders would be the result. Back when pays were carefully distributed, back when she would read him tales in bed, fairy tales, cosy mysteries, fiction that seemed to be constructed out of chuckles. It mattered little. It was her gift of the golden voice, nurtured by many years' practice in front of the wide-eyed children of storytime that spread the aroma of satisfaction. Ah, but weren't they but children themselves, playing and chattering and falling asleep on the couch. Bronwyn was good at naps. Not everyone was. Many women were too hyper to relax. Sometimes only wine and orgasms would solve the issue. A debate for another time, perhaps? Perhaps all debates should be scheduled for another time, the interim being used for dabbing one's lips with a soft tissue. He chuckled himself out of that corner and pushed himself into the day feeling more than a tad triumphant. Out in the real world, the clouds had brought that not-so-rare gift of Muggy, and his morning constitutional crafted its pace accordingly. "Looks like rain," called one of his neighbours, head raised, weeds in hand. "Aye," called the Scots to the fore. He'd gotten the impression this past couple of years that a touch of the accent carefully placed could work small wonders on the street. On the street where he lived. Song title, no? Sinatra? Crossing the Lakeshore Bridge into town, Andrew wound up the urban chatterbox he kept for such occasions. Yes, he seemed to be in fine fettle. Some of the gang were already installed at the famed caffeine dispensary, and he settled for an extended bout of camaraderie. That's what guys were good for, and he was glad of it. The conversation ran the gamut of world affairs, sports, women with tight asses, tax reform, sloppy municipal enforcement, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, nail guns, women with pert breasts, sports, and college fees. Andrew was amused to see a couple of leggy teenage girls in tight blue jeans, shorts, and low-cut blouses parade by without anyone seeming to notice. Galen leaned over and whispered, "Jailbait." Andrew grinned, allowing for a slight nod. Then the talk turned to late summer vegetables and autumn fruits. Pear, garlic, and raspberry swaps were arranged. Another shapely teenage girl bent over Galen and seemed to be looking for a favour. Turned out to be one of his daughters, so enlarged from her petite self of the year before she was barely recognisable, asking for latte money. Family dynamics. Andrew imagined himself moving in that direction soon enough. No more bachelorizing for him. Someone would be calling him daddy and maybe puking on his shoulders. Someone else would be calling him you and demanding equal time in the spotlight. How much time after Alex's passing would be appropriate for the Passover? Galen asked why he looked so distracted. Woman trouble? Andrew was carving out a believable lie from his storehouse of plausible fictions when Galen was distracted by the appearance of that urban cliché, a shapely blonde, of which Rowanton was in no short supply. Needless to say, Galen was often distracted. Then someone brought up the topic of the Leafs' new manager, and away they went. Andrew listened in respectfully as the opinions were batted back and forth. Not much of a fan, he'd long ago learned to at least look interested. All was safer that way. The millions debated certainly piqued his interest. Managers were worth that much? Players as superstars, yes, but managers? Someone plonked down the Star and he picked up the business section, but he was not in the mood for crisis here and expansion there. On another day he might be fascinated, but today irritants nibbled away at his focus. Maybe if he sent 20,000 over, Bronwyn would leave him alone. That sounded like an easy fix, but not much like life. And certainly not like Bronwyn. He recalled challenging her when she first unearthed the cad. He's a classic case of desultory vivacity. Being an English lit wonk, she chuttled but quickly became vexed and argumentative and would have no truck with his assertions of permanent pothead status. Later, she called it vitriol. He thought that unusual, even for expansive vocabulary. She was more like the unmitigated gall type, but vitriol it had been, as in spew your vitriol. It was still cloudy and muggy when he emerged onto the main street, thinking to leisurely stroll. Everyone else had something else to do, an errand, an appointment, a duty. Galen cautioned him to stay out of trouble and warned that there was no more bail money in the kiddie. Andrew laughed and waved and moved south toward the lakefront, where some shade of serenity always waited in hiding to nab him. Before he reached that quandary, he ran into Gale and Winston. While he and Gale exchanged pleasantries, Winston sniffed at his pocket. Andrew noticed and reached in to find the crumbs of a muffin, which he pulled out and held in his open palm for Winston to lick. He briefly wondered how the crumbs managed to insert themselves, but sensing Gale's amusement being quickly replaced by impatience, he gave up and resumed the chat. She was off to visit family for the weekend and has the usual psyching up to do. Andrew nodded grinningly and almost asked, "What's a weekend?" but then realized he didn't even know what day it was. Then they discussed her uncle, or one of them. Apparently there was a team who had turned to dump truck driving out of retirement boredom. Andrew commented quasi-professionally that there was nothing noisier and more rattly than a dump truck, and he pitied the poor fellow. Gale agreed and wondered how much longer he would last. Well, she'd find out soon enough. Winston tugged and they were off. Andrew proceeded to the magical bliss dispensing waters in an orderly fashion, never for a moment doubting their endlessly renewed charm. Tiny breezes breathed upon him as he stood admiring the view he cared not to describe. Not that there was anyone there to listen, but there was. Lara, a ghost in transition to her next life, hovered close by, just as she might if she were still in the flesh. His surrender to the lake's benison was as palpable as ever. Many times had she sheltered in its shadow, sharing what was freely given, and she knew it would not be long before it was freely given again. She would be held in his arms and adored. They would roll and giggle on the lawn. They would skate in cold circles and scamper after puppies. She could see the pictures. She was in the pictures. She was the baby and the little boy. That womb waited, awaited, but not quite yet. She had to say goodbye to her last mum and dad. Chapter 3, The Mere Mention of Murder. After a couple or 3 days of this, days when the average Joe drove to work and worried about his kids' college tuitions and his wife's nagging about the new kitchen countertops, Andrew felt oppressed at the mere mention of murder. Between Janet's fretting and Bronwyn's guilt-tripping piety, he'd become caught between a rock and a hard place. But then it all evaporated. Well, sort of. Janet flew out west to vacation with her parents, and Bronwyn emailed to confess that her beau had disappeared, not only with the funds Andrew had transferred, but the cash she had managed to wangle from her mother's savings. He cabbed to the bank and never came back. She continued to argue for his innocence and was sure that he'd thought the frame-up would stick, through the trial, and put him behind bars. Andrew didn't really care whether he'd bought his escape across the border at the reservation by Cornwall, or if he'd trained it to Montreal and snuck on some Atlantic crossing liner. At least Bronwyn was free from his shadow and might find her path in life beyond nursing his wastrel wounds. She, of course, felt God said to save his wretched soul. Not that she'd ever admit it. She said he was very deserving. Often within the same 5 minutes, she declared herself to be reading an improving book. That oblique Bronwyn humour that so charmed her, probably more than her unadorned beauty, that peaches and cream collection, completely without cosmetics and only occasionally marred by a zit.